I got that. If you cannot participate, then you need to let me know because participation is a large part of your grade. And unless you have a good reason and we discuss it, I expect everyone to participate by volunteering. By volunteering at the beginning of a session to discuss the text. So you'll have had to have read the text and be ready to engage with me and kind of entertain the rest of the students, you know. Another point, I'll ask for volunteers in just a moment for today. Another point, two more points. I do not watch the clock. My brain is going, I'm thinking about you guys, I'm explaining things. So if you see that we're over time, please let me know. Because, you know, last time we went way over time and I hadn't even realized it until we were off camera. Because I've got lots of things going on here. I've got two screens going and notes over here and so on. Children running around in my house. And I usually have this problem anyways because I get lost in what I'm thinking about. So please do remind me. It's not rude. It's perfectly fine. Reminding me before the time is over, that's a little bit rude, and I would rather we not do that. Yeah. Like, but if it's time, let me know. Let me see. Is that? There's one thing left, but I've forgotten it at the moment. It's no big deal. Okay, volunteers. Who would like to volunteer for today? Okay. I need to know your name.
I would like to. I would like to volunteer.
Who is speaking?
Maya Hadib.
Let me see if I can find you on I'm looking for you. Can you type your name in the chat?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
1 second.
So far I have Akasha.
Yeah.
Who else? Joy, you want to volunteer?
Yes.
Joy. Who else? Maya?
Yeah.
Wants to. So I have 3 so far. Maya, Joy, Akasha. Oh, Soft 10 PC, you don't want to join? No. Okay. Let me share my screen. Right now, I just have 3. I'm looking for more. In the meantime, I'll share my screen. Let's see, where is it? There we go. And generally, please then turn on your videos, and I can force someone. Let's see, Hadi, would you like to volunteer?
Yes, sure.
Okay. I know today maybe some of you aren't as prepared as you'd like to be, so no big worry for today. Alexandra, you want to volunteer? It's also seeing if people are actually
Sorry,
here.
Professor, I'm not well prepared. I only read half of it.
Would you still like to volunteer?
I don't know. I don't think I'd have a lot to say.
Well, let's try it.
Okay. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Why not? Now your name's on a list. Your grade's going up as we speak. So good things are happening. Okay, so
Yeah.
all of you should have read. So for today, the reading was what, page 9 through 19. It's not a lot of reading of the Copernicus text. That is what we'll spend most of the day today going through. First, I wanted to take you through and say some things about the quiz. Does that sound like fun? How did you guys find the quiz?
It was easy,
it was-
mostly. I just
yeah,
had
it was
trouble
good.
with one question a bit.
Just one question. Yeah, they're not intended to be extremely difficult, but you'll see there are a lot of wrong answers. Yeah, you can see here on my screen. So it's not as simple maybe as everyone would hope. Let's see. Let's just go through a couple. If a significant number of people missed them, then we'll go through the questions and let's see what the answers are. Only maybe 2 or a couple people missed the first question. Let's just see what it was. Which of the following is among the important developments that take place during the time period covered in this course? The rise of modern science, the rise and fight against various superstitions, including that of witchcraft, decrease in the power of the Catholic Church and increase in the sense of regional identities, the creation of academic disciplines, all of the above. Of course, it's all of the above, right? Some people just, you got tired. Did someone choose A?
Yeah, I chose A, but after I chose it, I realized how wrong it was.
Okay.
It was too late.
Yeah, sometimes we just we click the wrong thing. So maybe that's just something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I mean, this period, if you watch the videos, it's a really interesting period in time. And what's also nice about it, if you read about the ancient period, I mean, many of you took 201. The Odyssey, it's a nice story. It's an adventure story, but people are completely different. They have different interests and their value system. You know, Odysseus is just a horrible, horrible human being by our standards. And none of the things that he loves and praises are things that we really love or praise, right? Lying, killing, stealing, these are his ideals, as long as you do it correctly. But those are not our ideals. And the same thing goes for the medieval period. Although many of you are perhaps religious, the medieval period when religion really dominated the whole Western world, including the Middle East, that was a religion that if many of you lived in it now, you would find it so incredibly foreign to what you have now, because many of the things you value and take for granted just were not part of the outlook, nor within religion, nor outside of religion. In this modern period is when people kind of turned into people like us. And so all these things are kind of being, the things that we take for granted are being created and being fought for, and people are dying for certain kinds of ideals that now we take for granted. And these are all among them, right? I particularly find a couple of these very, I mean, the fall of the decline of the Catholic Church, okay, lots of political and religious entities decline over time. That's not so interesting. The rise of modern science, that's very interesting, but we all know that came about in this period. This issue about superstitions is quite interesting because as you might have learned during my lecture, this was during the time that the Catholic Church lost its power, Protestantism became a major factor in Europe particularly. And this led to countless wars and deaths during various wars. Germany itself was ravaged by wars. The same thing happened in England. And so what happens in a period in which, and this has happened in every period, ancient, medieval, and modern, in which the social structure vanishes, in which there's no protections and everybody has to kind of kill their neighbor just to survive, then people turn largely not to religion in a normal sense, but to superstitious forms of religion, right? So in this very time when you've got this rise of modern science, at the same time, you have the rise of kind of anti-scientific thinking, right? Astrology. There was a book published on witchcraft in the 1700s already, the first book on witchcraft, you know, how to identify a witch. We now make fun of this stuff, you know, in Monty Python and whatnot. You know, they see if the witch floats if you tie rocks to her or something like this. This is one of the scientific methods of telling whether she's a witch. Of course, she doesn't. She dies, but then you only know that she's not a witch after you've killed her. Right? It's a bit of a catch-22. Burn her, and if she doesn't burn, then she's a witch, you know? So you've heard of like, I mean, it's very popular in American media, the Salem witch trials and all this stuff. It's all the same period. It happened all over Europe and the United States. That wasn't an isolated thing. So today, a lot of people, you know, you watch YouTube or whatever, there's all these fights between the atheists or the, you know, Richard Dawkins and the religious people. That's been going on since the beginning of the modern period. It's a late version of the same thing. Except in the modern period, it was much more clear that you could be scientifically minded and be religious, just not superstitious, right? You didn't believe in this kind of, because it's interesting, superstition is kind of a weird mix between almost like scientific thinking, right? Like, let's identify witches and they have these powers and so on, and religion, right? And so a lot of the people, you won't know this because we don't read these books anymore, but just as there was the first book on witchcraft published in the period, so also many of these people that we're going to read about, actually in another part of their life we're not reading, wrote books against things like witchcraft. The first major Enlightenment philosopher in Germany, whose name was Christian Thomasius, was famous for his legal theory and for pretty much getting rid of certain laws relating to witches in Germany at the time. So that's how kind of integral to the mindset this was. That gives a different kind of take on what science is about as well, defending science. It's not in the first instance anti-religion, but it is anti-superstition. This issue of regional identities, it's very interesting. Many people who teach a course on this or who are thinking about the modern period often think of it as a kind of a period in which Europe was very Eurocentric, you know? The Enlightenment, they thought they were, you know, the best of the world and so on. And that to a certain extent, there is some truth in that, but to a greater part, there's not. Because what you see in this period is the creation of nations and nation states for the first time. Europe before the modern period was dominated by princes and kings and queens and things, and they were all brothers and sisters no matter what country they were from, right? They were the royal families of Europe. So nobility and government was a European institution, not a regional country or nation-based institution. And the way you got power was your brother gave you a parcel of land and you became the prince of that parcel of land, right? And that parcel of land may be half of Italy. And he may have given it to you because you're his favorite brother or something, right? That's how you get power and political power. And if you live in a state like that, that's how the people who have authority over your life and death, that's how they got it, right? Nepotism. Now that seems to be happening again in the world a little bit, but it will probably never get back to the way it was as much as it was, because that was just the accepted mode. Same thing with religion. I mean, the Catholic Church before Protestantism, and even after Protestantism, you only had two religions, right? And they had great power in conjunction with the princes and kings. And so these were pan-European institutions. But in the modern period, that's when these also you had Latin as the one language that all educated people spoke, right? So the idea of being German, the idea of being Italian, the idea of being French, that's one of the things that was first created in this period. And the idea of being proud of where you're from and speaking your local language and all this. Of course, that's what led to World War II eventually. World War I and World War II is the creation of nation states that could fight each other in this way. So we got bad things out of that and good things out of that, right? But this period, if you look at it as a whole, is not one where you have one European entity where everybody thinks similar things. It's actually where that disappears. So it's the kind of the opposite of what sometimes you get in the popular view of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was actually run by a couple of scholars, you know, who had some radical ideas. They weren't the whole of the Europe or anything of that kind. So also when that happens, people start writing in their local languages, and so they can't read each other anymore. So intellectual unity around Europe disappears. If you start writing in German, the English don't read it. The Italians might read it, might not read it. If you write in Italian, no one reads you except the Italians, right? So your audience as an author changes as well, right? Copernicus, of course, wrote in Latin, so he knew everybody. Nationality was not an issue for him. But this is early in the period. Okay, let's go to the next, back to the results table. Everyone except a couple got the second question correct, so we won't do it. 3 as well, it seems to have been easy. 4, there were a lot of ACs. Let's see what that question was. The following best describes Aristotle's understanding of astronomy. Astronomy is the queen of the sciences because it studies things closer to God. Astronomy is just a branch of mathematics, which is not concerned with giving real or natural explanations of things. Astronomy is not the highest science, but it does give natural explanations. And Aristotle does not talk about astronomy. What's the correct answer?
It's B.
B. How did we do? So about 20% of people said it's the highest science, but it does give natural explanations. What does this mean, natural explanations?
He said that natural science is like physics, which now we know that most of it is math anyways, but that's what he classified.
And did you get a sense of, so what would be a natural explanation and what would be a not a natural explanation?
A natural explanation.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Akasha.
Okay, so a natural explanation would be more philosophical in the sense that it has to deal with the nature of the thing. For example, a rock falls towards the earth, not because of gravity, but because of it's made of earth. So it's a sort of a like-to-like principle. A non-natural explanation would have to be a mathematical one, which has to do with astronomy.
Yeah. So this is something that's hard for, kind of surprising to a lot of us. You say, well, maybe the ancients, they didn't have mathematical science in our sense, so maybe that's because they didn't have a very well-developed mathematics. Absolutely not. They were incredible mathematicians, and the ancient mathematics was used all throughout the medieval and modern periods. The thing is, they didn't believe, they understood mathematics differently and numbers differently. They thought of mathematical entities as ideal forms, which don't exist in the real world, right? So there are no perfect spheres in nature. So how could you have your physics based upon perfect spheres, right? Think about that. When Galileo proposed the principle of inertia, he talked about a perfect sphere rolling on a perfectly flat surface with no friction, and said it would travel forever, right? And the response, this is actually in one of his books on the two chief world systems, an Aristotelian, it's a dialogue, he's talking with an Aristotelian and a representative of the church. And the Aristotelian says, you know, what does that have to do with the question about the motion of bodies? There are no perfect spheres. There are no perfectly flat surfaces. There is friction. So how can all of that, how can your mathematical model be an explanation of reality if those things are not in reality, and reality is different? Moreover, mathematics isn't about change. It's about things that are eternal. Physics is about change and motion, right? The idea that you could model motion with mathematics actually takes some quite advanced mathematics, right? The use of variables and particularly the development of the idea of rates of change, right? Like in calculus. So that was actually a major, that happened in the 1690s that's a major shift when people start thinking that the mathematical world can include things that move, right? And they aren't just fixed eternal things. So in short, in Aristotle's structure of science as he understood it, you had, as Akasha explained, you had certain kinds of reasons for natural things, and those are the real reasons why those things happen. And why does Earth fall? Because its nature as Earth is to be at the center of the universe. Why does fire rise? Because it is the nature of the matter, the material of fire, to rise towards the heavens, right? And so this sounds like a strange way of explaining things, but it's not that far from what we still do, Why do two pieces of matter attract one another? Because it's the nature of matter to attract according to the law of gravity, right? It's not all that different because we still have this notion of what is natural. It's what doesn't need to be explained. It's just what you use to explain other things. But they had this very different notion of natural. And importantly, that sort of reasoning doesn't have anything directly to do with mathematics. So cosmology, Aristotle's cosmology, has nothing about mathematics in it, aside from some explanations about why planets move in circles. That sounds kind of mathematical, but the reason it has nothing to do with the mathematics of the circle. It has to do with the perfection of the circle and these other kind of qualitative aspects. So you had cosmology, that's in natural science, but then astronomy was an art, right? It was this use of mathematics for predicting the motions of the planets and for drawing up calendars and these kinds of things. And it was purely a calculative science, right? It did not give explanations. Its sole goal was to build mathematical models that succeeded in predicting things, right? With no pretension, as we'll see, of being true in the sense of getting to the reality and the explanation behind it, right? So it didn't give natural explanations, astronomy. It is also it's not the highest science. It's not even close, but that's okay. Just a branch of mathematics, not concerned with natural explanations. Let's see. It's not the queen of the sciences. We will see this is an important idea. They did hold astronomy to be kind of high, particularly astronomers, because it does deal with things closer to God. That is an idea. The problem is it doesn't deal with them philosophically, right? Scientifically in our sense of modern physics. Aristotle is not talking. Okay, back to the questions. Let's go a little quicker. 5 doesn't look to have been a problem. 6, there are some mistakes. Let's see. Ptolemy's model is best described as which of the following? What's the answer? Someone want to tell me?
It's D.
D. It's an exquisite mathematical model built using some of the best available data to anyone in the ancient world. So why are these others wrong? Let's see what others put. A. Is a model based on Aristotle's physics. Well, so you can see there's two problems with that answer. First of all, Aristotle's physics, it's not based on Aristotle's astronomy nor on his physics, sure, which would be part of natural science. It's not because as an astronomer, Ptolemy gave himself absolute freedom to build a model mathematically however he needed to, simply to fit his data. And he is I mentioned in the video, the Almagest, his most famous book. That's actually an Arabic title you might recognize because his book was transmitted through the Arabic scholars as well. And he went out and he did incredible observations. This is something I cannot say enough. The ancients did observations. They took data they did calculations. This is often a mistake that people make when they think of modern science. They say, well, modern science is empirical. They do experiments and they take measurements and so on, and the ancients didn't do that, right? There's this old thing that people say like, well, Aristotle, he didn't really do any science. He just, there's a case where he puts down the wrong number of teeth in a certain animal's mouth, and they say, because he never looked in the animal's mouth, if he had, he'd have the right number, but no, he just made it up as he went, right? Even Stephen Hawking, some of you have heard of Stephen Hawking, I suppose. If you read his book on the history of science, he paints Aristotle this way, right? And the ancients as a whole, as people who just didn't do mathematical, and data-driven investigations, but they did. But you can see their data couldn't have the same kind of impact as ours does, because they thought their data was this separate calculative science as part of this astronomy that doesn't give natural explanations, right? So they still took incredible data and spent an enormous amount of energy, time, and genius making measurements. And that's one of the reasons Ptolemy is still remembered today, because he went out and took measurements that were never surpassed until the telescope, right? This is not as simple as you might think. This requires building enormous instruments, not telescopes, but you build these enormous instruments so that you can measure angles in the sky and so on, right? And they have to be, that's a craft. So he built an exquisite mathematical model. It actually fit all of his data, right? As crazy as Ptolemy's model looks, it fits the data and predicts everything just great. That's why he was Ptolemy, right? And his data was used by Copernicus. So was his model, as we'll see, but for a different reason. Okay, that was 6. 7 doesn't look to have been too bad, but 8 gave people some trouble. Which of the following is not a feature of the Aristotelian universe? D, universal gravitation. Universal gravitation, this is something that's this is not part of the Aristotelian universe. This is also not part of Copernicus's universe. The idea of universal gravitation, what is the idea of universal gravitation? Someone want to tell us all? Alexandra, you don't have to have read for this.
Isn't it a scientific explanation as to why things are attracted towards the Earth? Like, isn't it gravity?
Gravity, and how does gravity operate?
It's been proven through science.
Yeah, but what does it state? If you had to state the principle of gravitation, what would it be?
I don't know. I'm not good at physics.
It's a manifestation of the curvature of space-time.
Okay. In a simple layman's form, you're going to be slightly more advanced than I was hoping, but all matter in the universe is attracted to other matter in the universe by the inverse square of the distance between them, right? In proportion to the inverse square of the distance. Or you could have it as Akasha has, it's a curvature of space-time, but it's a curvature of space-time that affects the paths of all bodies with matter, with mass, right? Has to do with mass. And it's universal. This was the idea. All matter in the universe attracts other matter in the universe, right? You can have local gravitation. Like, I can think that my fan here attracts me, but it doesn't attract, my door over there because my door is too far away. No, that's not universal gravitation. That's just local attraction. And it can be, and this was called gravity for things on the Earth, right? So Aristotle had this idea that Earth goes to the center of the Earth. That's not universal gravitation, right? Because for Aristotle, two rocks do not attract each other. They do. It's just such a tiny amount of attraction that you and I will not notice it. One of the first they did an experiment where they showed the pyramids in Giza had could attracted a small object. They could actually measure the force sideways by by one of the pyramids due to its mass, to show that it's not just that the Earth attracts things, but other matter attracts other pieces of matter. This is important in an astronomical context, because when you think about the solar system and you don't have a principle of inertia, right, then it seems, and of course, why would you have a principle of inertia if you haven't developed that part of your physics yet? And you look at the planets and their motions on any model, it seems incomprehensible that they attract one another, because they seem to move independently, right? The moon doesn't fall into the Earth doesn't fall into the sun, Jupiter doesn't fall into the sun. You'd think if there was universal gravitation, everything in the universe would fall into one ball. Why doesn't it? Anyone have an answer to that? Maybe there is no universal gravitation.
Well, I could provide an answer.
Okay, please
It's simply because the planets that are gravitating around the sun have enough horizontal speed to offset the gravity. But that's pretty much it.
do. Inertia, right?
Yeah.
They want to go in a straight line, and that's perfectly, they want to go off at the tangent of their orbit.
So
And
they're
there's-
always in motion, and
Yeah.
that's what's keeping them from falling into each other.
And inertia goes in a straight line, but the force is perpendicular to that towards the body, and so that keeps them constantly like going like this, right?
Yes.
Otherwise they would fall. So this is something that happens often in the history of science. To understand one principle and see the need for it, like or the possibility of it even, universal gravitation, you have to have another piece of the puzzle, inertia. Or else when you look at the planets, you say, obviously they don't attract one another, or else they would fall together, right? You'd have to believe there's somehow another principle that's universal that keeps them from doing that, right? And you would not guess that, you would have no reason to. It's hard, you can't get one piece of the puzzle until you get the other. And this is a problem with the progress of science often. So the ancients and Copernicus, they just thought circles were the way bodies moved in space. That's it. They're perfect, they're repeating, they must be the natural motion. We now know it's not the natural motion in that sense. They could move in other ways, but it so happens the balance of forces has that happen. So there was no universal gravitation, not until, Newton, who drew up the first real theory of universal gravitation, is around the year 1700. Copernicus wrote in 1543. So long time later, before that comes about. All the other things, so certainly universal gravitation is not part of the Aristotelian universe. A distinction between physics below the moon and physics above the moon. This was an absolutely central part of ancient and medieval astronomy and natural science. Actually, it's not something within astronomy so much as within cosmology and natural science, because it basically means as you saw before, physical explanations are based upon the kind of matter that you're talking about. If you want to explain the motion of fire, you need to know what fire is, and then you can understand its motion. And so things below the moon are made of the four elements, which move in straight lines. And everything above the moon is made of another element, the sometimes so-called quintessence, right? Fifth element, and its natural motion is in circles, right? The ancients and the medievals and even Copernicus thought of straight motion and circular motion as two different heterogeneous kinds of motions. Right? Copernicus will see breaks that a little bit. He talks about how things could be moving in straight lines and circles at the same time. To the ancients and the medieval philosophers and scientists, this would have been crazy talk, right? And what does this mean? This is very significant because it means all the physics below the moon doesn't apply above the moon, and all the physics above the moon doesn't apply below. And so some of you have heard of, the story of a man named Isaac Newton. There's this probably false story of him seeing the apple fall, and thinking this could be the principle that holds the planets in orbit, right? Now he does talk about swinging buckets on strings, and he compares the forces involved in that to the forces on planets. To do that, you have to believe the physics below the moon is like the physics above the moon, right? So you can see, without breaking down this barrier, this division between the sublunarary and the superlunarary, the whole way of thinking of that drove modern science and the discovery of universal gravitation was not possible, because there could be no similarities between the physics below the moon and above the moon. And that was exactly the power of Newton's idea, which was to use local physics that we do here and see that it's analogous and could explain things up there, all right? So we'll see in this period, there's a lot of, Copernicus was one of the first, but Bruno, and then later Galileo, they all had to kind of wage this battle in proving to people that things in space were not of a wholly different kind. Later, the telescope had some role in this, because they could look at through the telescope and see mountains on the moon, right? And they could see it wasn't perfect and unchanging. It looks like it's changed a lot. Galileo looked at sunspots. If the sun was unchanging and perfect, then it shouldn't have these spots showing up and disappearing at different times, right? Which it does, sunspots. Also, according to the ancient model of the universe, everything rotated around the center. But when Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, he discovered there are things that rotate also around other planets, thereby kind of showing that it wasn't like people thought it was, right? And then that makes you think, well, maybe we're wrong about a lot of things, right? Opened up a new path there. Okay, 7 looks okay. Oh no, we just did 8, didn't we? 9. What is the name of the plane through which the moon and the planets pass in the sky? Okay, this is just a technical one. Maybe you didn't remember it. It's called the ecliptic, right? If you go out at night and you look parallel with the Corniche, that is kind of the ecliptic up in the sky, parallel but up. It's where the moon passes, it's where Jupiter passes. You can all go out and see Jupiter tonight if it's clear. It'll be the brightest thing in the sky. The equant, this is the opposite of the Earth on the other side of the eccentric center of the Ptolemaic universe, the equant. The deferent is what we call an orbit of a major orbit, right, of Jupiter or Mars or whatever, that's called the deferent. And the epicycle was the circle on the circle in the Ptolemaic model. Okay, a lot of people got 10 wrong. Universal gravitation is a feature of the Copernican universe. Okay, we already covered that. No, it wasn't, right? How did we do? Okay, there, 52% of people got that one wrong. But as I said, you will see the word gravity, even in the reading. But by that, he does not mean universal gravitation. It means local, it means heaviness. That's what gravity originally just means, right? Heavy. 11, in the Ptolemaic model, the circle which is placed on a circle is called what? Okay, it's another one of these, that's the epicycle. Let's try 12. There are no epicycles in the Copernican system. Okay, slightly tricky question, but it has a point behind it. What is the answer? There are no epicycles in the Copernican system.
True, right?
Someone
want to tell Lila her mistake?
There are epicycles, so it's false.
Which one is, where's the epicycle?
isn't oh,
What?
I think I'm mistaking my
There's at least
my
one that they knew of in the Copernican system. There are many more now that we know of. Someone who said this was false.
I think when Copernican talks about retrograde motion,
Yeah.
that for me was like enough for me to know that he believed in the epicycle. Like when he was explaining that the motion of the Earth was the reason why retrograde motion happened,
Yeah.
right?
So
I was like, okay, that probably believes in it.
but if you look at his
And then
go ahead. Yeah.
nothing. And then he mentioned that. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Okay. Well, the first thing you said, you should have been saying kind of the opposite. The idea of the Copernican model is kind of really good, excellent, and this is one of the reasons it was adopted by Copernicus at explaining retrograde motion without epicycles, right? So that should have indicated to you that there are no epicycles, but there is the moon, even in Copernicus's system. The idea of an epicycle is a circle on a circle, right? Ptolemy had almost all the planets moving on circles on circles. So you had one large deferent circle and then another little circle on it, and the planet made a motion like this, right? Well, the moon still does that in the Copernican system, right? So too do the moons of Jupiter, but he didn't know about them, and many other things. So those are technically epicycles. Why ask this question? Because a lot of people, if you read, again, popular books on the history of astronomy or whatever, they will depict it as if Ptolemy had this crazy model. It's just ridiculous looking. Look at it, it's got all these epicycles. The epicycle idea is just flatly, obviously not true. And so Copernicus looked at that model and he said, this is ridiculous. And he came up with this other simple model. And so he's a genius, you know? There was no problem for Copernicus with epicycles. He did not find that to be a problem at all. And he had an epicycle in his own.
Sorry, I confused ecliptic and epicycle.
Aha, yeah.
That's
So-
why I just said I assume there's an ecliptic.
Yeah, so epicycle is circle on a circle.
Yeah,
Like
so
your
the answer is
epidermis
true,
is on the
no?
outside. Yeah. It's the skin on you, a cycle on the other circle. Now, why is Copernican epicycles, why do those make us more comfortable? Because the moon, we have an explanation for the moon's epicycle. It moves around, it is attracted to the Earth, and it orbits the Earth just as the Earth orbits the sun, right? But without universal gravity, and we look at Ptolemy's epicycles and we say, these are crazy because there's nothing at the center of his epicycles, right? They're just circles, things moving in circles, on circles with no mass at the middle of that circle, right? That doesn't happen for us, but that's because we think we have universal gravitation to explain our cycles and epicycles. But with no universal gravitation, both in Copernicus and in Ptolemy, all epicycles are the same, no matter whether there's mass in the middle or not, right? So that's not an issue at all. So Copernicus didn't have a problem with epicycles. That's not why he changed it. He did have a problem with there being so many epicycles, and those epicycles being very complicated and unrelated to one another. And so in his model, almost all the epicycles disappear all at once with one major hypothesis, which is the Earth's motion. And the Earth's motion explains almost all of the epicycles except for the moon. And they disappear. And that kind of economy and simplicity that arises due to one hypothesis that the Earth moves, that's what made him think it was true, right? So back to the table. 13, not too bad. 14 seems to have terrorized a lot of people. Which of the following was an important idea for Copernicus, but not for Aristotle? That the universe was created by God. Why was that not an idea of Aristotle's? What did Aristotle think?
Because Aristotle spoke of an unmoved mover type of God, not a creator God.
Not a creator God. The world, although I may not have said this in the lecture, but you saw that the way God relates to the universe in Aristotle is by being the source of motion, not the creator. Aristotle actually believed that the world and even species are eternal. It's always been there. So if the world was eternal and you're looking for God in Aristotle's universe, you don't look for it in the existence of things or in their structures, because their structures are not created. So there's no evidence of a creator in them. You look for Aristotle's God in motion and change, and go back to the thing that is the ultimate source of that. Whereas in the modern world, where most of us think of, I don't think that any of you believe in an eternal world created by an eternal God that doesn't create it, but actually only moves it. I suppose that's a very rare belief these days. All of you are fairly familiar with a monotheistic religion that has a creator, right? And when you have a creator, you look at the world and say, why did that creator create it like this? And now there's lots to be said, right? Like maybe God created the world as it is for human beings. That was for the long time an answer, right? Or maybe, as Copernicus will think, God is really kind of like a mathematician. And so he created the universe so that it would be mathematically simple and beautiful, right? But the point is, for people before Christianity and the idea of creation, that idea was not a possible one, not one that would be possible in astronomy to be considered, right? And also this goes further because, for instance, there was a famous King Alphonse who was Christian, and he was shown the Ptolemaic universe model. And he had this thought, right? He said, if God should have asked me how to create the universe because I could have done a better job, right? That's an idea you can't have if the universe is not created, right? The universe should be like this because someone who's designing it, and God's obviously the best designer, so it should have the best design. And Copernicus could look at the Ptolemaic model and say, that's probably not the real universe because it's just it's not systematic enough. It's not beautiful enough. It's not orderly enough. That was one of his absolutely major reasons for adopting his model. And you'll see this in the text. And he'll talk about God as a creator. But importantly, this idea of God is still not just the Christian God. It's the Christian God kind of, the Christian nerdy God version, right? It's not just the stern father idea. It's the stern father who's also a mathematician and likes beautiful mathematical objects and so on. Yes, Akasha?
Actually, this particular idea reminded me of what Plato said.
Yeah.
It was the exact opposite of what Aristotle said. So Plato's God was a craftsman.
Yes,
but
true.
the way he explains it, it's not that the universe was created to be mathematically perfect, but that the universe loved its creator so much that it strived to be as perfect as him, which explains the spherical structure of the universe and so on.
Yeah, and that is not strictly speaking a Christian view either of a creator God in quite the way, because it's a craftsman God. Because God doesn't create everything out of nothing. So that's slightly different. But you're right, it's somehow in the middle, right? Because it also has this idea, Aristotle had this idea of things loving God and striving to be like God, but it wasn't in their structure. It was in some other way. Also, I mean, and this is true, and this is all very, very interesting. But Aristotle's cosmology is very complicated and strange, or sorry, Plato's, strange even for Plato, right? And I'm not sure, but I think the Timaeus, which is where this is, I believe it might have been one of those texts that was lost for a long time in the West. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, actually, he discusses the creation of the universe and the four elements, and all of. He goes into even mathematical like details of how the ratios of the four elements were. It's all in Timaeus and
Yeah.
a little bit, yeah.
So if any of you want to read a really bizarre explanation of the origin of the universe with a lot of mathematical mysticism in it, the Timaeus is a good place to look. Okay, so that's the quiz. Any questions about the quiz or the procedure or anything there? Sometimes I do not let you know your answers, whether they're correct or not, or your scores, because I know you all have telephones and you can all talk to each other. So one of you, I just can't avoid it. I found this last semester. If I show everyone the scores all the time, the scores get really high really quickly. Yeah. So I'm hiding them. Sometimes, but I'll let you know, or we'll go through the quiz or whatever. I would prefer it not to be the case, and I would prefer it that you could all see your answers as soon as you gave them, right, with feedback. But I can't. Okay, so please have your text open there. We're going to start looking at the Copernicus text. Just a few general statements about this. So as you may remember, so keep this in your mind, this date, 1543. That's the year Copernicus died. It's also the year that this book was published. It was presented to him on his deathbed. He had had, I believe, a stroke. He was not conscious or able to appreciate that his great work was being published. But his friends took care of it, as we'll see. Now, books. So a couple of things about this. First of all, we should talk about books. Books were a relatively new thing in 1543, right? There's this thing called the books in the sense of things that are printed and published and sold, right? When was the printing press created? Anyone want to Google that? Or Gutenberg, you know? (1480s) probably, something like this. Someone want to find the exact date?
1440s.
What?
1440.
1440s.
Okay. But even if, so that's about, now 100 years is a very short time in this period. Things move very slowly. Just like the telescope way existed for quite a while before Galileo used it. He was the first person to turn to the sky and use it and to build a more powerful one. So also, although the printing press had been developed, it was still like the latest technology, right? And think about the impact that the printing press must have had. In the medieval period, the only way to have a book is to have to you yourself or someone else that you are master over or can pay to copy it by hand, right? A book, the value of a book was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. Books were not, this is a major fact that books then were not created for normal people. They were not created for being sold. They were not created to entertain, because when you want to sell things, you want to entertain people, you want to give them pleasure, you want to make them feel like they want to purchase the book, right? This is something that's true of modern printing from the beginning till today, but was not part of the medieval or ancient tradition of texts. Texts were just there to preserve information, right? And often texts were not allowed to be read. In the medieval Christian church, even Christians were not supposed to read the Bible. During the Protestant Reformation, there were people who were put to death by the Catholic Church for reading the Bible. Who was supposed to read the Bible? Priests. They were supposed to interpret it and to control the content of the doctrine. Normal people weren't supposed to read it because they'd come up with all kinds of heretical ideas because of their mistakes, right? So books where, if any of you want to read The Name of the Rose, this is a modern novel, kind of a Sherlock Holmes detective novel set in an ancient medieval monastery, partially in the library. And there you get a really good depiction of what a medieval kind of library was like. And one of the features is the library had a librarian who was the only person allowed to go into the library and see the books. It was like the keeper of the gate, and only with very special permission could you see the books and read. And there were certain shelves of books that were off limits without certain permission, right? Books were not for people. There were no dictionaries, no encyclopedias. There was no public knowledge to be shared in books. But as soon as the printing press is created, there comes the opportunity to make money. And human beings love to make money, right? You can make money by printing something. What are you going to print? Well, something that people want to read, right? And you will sell it. And once people will want to read this, they will want to become literate, more people will become literate. And this is going to take a long time, right? You can see why as soon as the printing press was invented, it didn't do anything for at least 100 years. But by the time Copernicus is around, the book trade is a major money-making trade in Europe with several important centers, and they made tons of money. People made their fortunes on selling books if you could find the right kind of book to print that people would buy. So don't lose track of this in your mind. This was true all the way, you know, why did Charles Dickens write such long novels? You've all read something by Charles Dickens. His novels are all huge. Why did Dostoevsky write huge novels? Because they made money off of it. Those novels were printed chapter by chapter as a magazine and sold to a group of people who had signed up to receive it. So you would sign up at the time, sometimes in old copies of Dickens books or whatever, you'll find a list of the subscribers at the back. So all the people who said, I will give you, you know, whatever it was, a couple shillings for each issue of your novel as it comes out. And you would send it every couple of weeks and they would read it, right? And you would make money. It was all about signing up people and making money. And if you want a long novel because you want to keep them on the hook for as long as possible, right? So these Charles Dickens novels, Dostoevsky novels, these are thought of as great pieces of literature, but they are still crafted and formed by the culture and the needs and the interests of the authors and others, right? Same thing for Copernicus's book. This book would have been, people would have wanted to print it. A printer would have been, you know, would have met someone like Copernicus, said, you have these amazing ideas that are going to be very controversial, right? That's the important thing. The more controversial, maybe the better. People wrote all kinds of crazy books in this period and often got themselves in trouble with religious authorities because they had these two competing interests, pleasing the authorities and writing a book that's going to make a lot of money, because the crazier it is, the more people are going to want to buy it and read it, right? So Copernicus himself wasn't that interested. He didn't want to publish this book. He was worried about its contents, but people around him wanted it published, including publishers, but also including religious people within the church. We don't know why they wanted him to publish it. Maybe they wanted to stir up trouble, maybe they didn't. But one thing seems to be true. They all believed he was the best. He was a genius throughout his entire life. He was the kind of person where everybody came from around Europe to work with him during doing astronomy. He was just the best mathematician. He knew the sources the best, and he was an authority. But he didn't publish nearly anything during his lifetime. So when he published this book, it would have been this, magnificent, beautiful thing. He never got to see it though, right? But you see this reflected here. Look, here's the beginning of this, important intellectual work. Diligent reader in this work, which has just been created and published. You have the motions of the fixed stars and planets as these motions have been reconstituted on the basis of ancient as well as recent observations. Da 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 da. Therefore, buy, read, and enjoy this work, right? Most of all, buy it. Published in Nuremberg. There is this little note I put here. Why is geometry so important? Does anyone know the source? If you look at the footnote, you'll find the source of this, but let no one untrained in geometry enter here.
Yeah, it's Plato.
It's Plato, and it was supposedly above the entrance to his academy, right? Something like this. Let no one untrained in geometry enter here. This quote has a kind of, there's a lot behind it, right? Because this is a mathematical work, right? To understand it, it has two kinds of, the idea there is, there's something about geometrical thought, mathematical thought, that extends beyond geometry. This was the idea in Plato as well, right? The forms, the philosophical ideas, Plato always thought were like mathematical forms. Goodness and justice were like triangle and square and so on. There were these eternal, unchanging realities. And the kind of intellectual activity that it took to understand mathematics was similar in training and method to the kind of thinking it took to do philosophy, really, right? Except philosophy was higher and those forms were even above the mathematical forms. But the idea there is there's a kind of thinking involved in mathematics. And if you aren't skilled in that kind of thinking, well, you might as well not enter. You might as well not. Now, if this is a book about the universe, then this is saying, if you want to understand the universe, you first need to be a mathematician. You can already see the danger of that idea. Because I don't think the Pope was a mathematician. Underlying this, it says, dear Pope, what was it? Pope, which was it? The 8th, Urban the 8th. That was during Galileo's time. If you don't know geometry, then you do not know and understand God's creation, which is the universe, right? I'm just have a second here because my electricity's out. So I've lost half of my, okay, it's coming back on. There, you're all back for me. Okay. Galileo will later have a similar quote. He says, the universe, this is in one of his works, he says, the book of nature is written in special symbols. They are circles and squares and so on. And if you do not understand the language, you cannot read the book, right? In other words, this takes authority away from religious figures, right? It says the authority belongs to those who are technically skilled in mathematics and science, not those who read the Bible or whatever. So already here, there's a little bit of a, now this was certainly, this idea wasn't in Copernicus's mind. For him, the idea was, if you don't know geometry, you're not going to understand the reasoning I give in this book. And so you're just gonna throw my book away, right? But later, this takes on that significance, and it's already kind of implicitly there. You would want to deny it, but it's still already implicit there. Here's the actual original title page. You can see the Plato quote is in Greek. The rest is in, notice it's still in Latin. Even in this period, the people who are going to buy this book are going to read Latin. So even though it's going to be a popular book, This tells you the time of history it's written. 100 years later, it would be written in, or at least translated into the languages that normal people would speak, right? Still, this has a bit of a small readership. Okay, so why look at this? Let me talk a little bit about books for a second. When you read a book, especially a historical book, and one of the things of this course is kind of learning how to approach texts, right? Historical texts. When you read a book, even the title page like that, very significant, worth spending your time on. You'll find that most of a book like this is not worth your time. I mean, if you were a scholar who is deeply interested in mathematical methods of Copernicus's period, you might work through some of the later chapters, but that's only really for specialists. This is a book that absolutely changed Western thought. It's one of the most important books ever written, but most of what's important about it for you and I is not in the heart of the book. It's just the way it is. You should spend your time, and our time is best spent, looking at some of the things you would usually just pass over, right? If you were to buy this book at a bookstore without this class, you would probably not look very closely at the title page. You might probably skip over the foreword. You might even skip over the introduction, because that's what we do today, right? If you buy a book, I don't read the introduction to most of my books. But for older books particularly from this period, the introduction and the forewords are usually the most important thing, and maybe the only thing that's still important to us. There, the author is essentially speaking to you, trying to explain to you the purpose, structure, and method of what's in the book, right? And most of the things that people write in this book, Copernicus's theory is false, right? It's false. Planets do not move in circles. The universe is not just the solar system. According to modern science, right, it's not even correct to say that the planets rotate around the sun, right? Rotation, motion is a relative concept. You can consider them rotating around just about anything you like in the universe, right? If you want to know later in the course, I'll show you a short video where we see how the Earth is really moving in space, and it's to say it's rotating around the sun is the least interesting thing about its motion, because we're moving around the center of the universe and we're moving so his complete theory is not true, right? Why is it important then? It's important for the manner of thinking and the reasons he gives, and what it tells us about thinking of the time, and what that tells us about our thinking today, right? So, as I say, the introductions, we'll see this with a lot of thinkers this period in this course. The reader is full of introductions and prefaces and things like this. So this is a particularly tricky work. This foreword is by someone named Andreas Osiander. Does anyone know who that was?
Yeah, it was Copernicus' close friend.
He was a close friend. He was a Protestant preacher, I believe. And when this was published, this title was not here. This is a modern edition that's added because someone reading this book for the first time in 1543 would have just seen "to the reader concerning the hypothesis of the work." And they would have assumed, as they did assume, that this is all written by Copernicus himself. But it was not, and he never saw it. Osiander, when Copernicus was already on his deathbed, Osiander was overseeing the publishing, and he got cold feet, as it were, right? And he decided he would slap on a preface that would essentially say this book belongs to the tradition of Aristotelian astronomy and has no pretensions to being true physics, right? That's what the preface essentially says. But for about 100 years, so this book was not banned. It was not banned by the Catholic Church. It wasn't blacklisted because of this preface. It wasn't until later Pope Urban VIII asked Galileo his opinion on this work. And he specifically asked Galileo, did Copernicus write the foreword? And Galileo said, certainly not. Right? Galileo was a very crafty fellow. But he told the Pope no. At this time, Galileo was saying, well, everything Copernicus says is too crazy to be true. He believed it was true, but he said to the Pope, because he was afraid of trouble, he said, no one could possibly believe Copernicus. It's so crazy. But Copernicus really did mean what he says in the rest of the book. All right? That led to the banning of it, because this was some 10, 15 years or so before Galileo himself was condemned. So let's look and see what the view is.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
But
excuse me?
it's 12:50. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like time's up.
It's 12:15. I will see you all on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Sure, see you then.
Professor, can I ask you just 2 questions?
Yeah, sure.
In the first video, you mentioned that there are 3 themes that we'll be discussing, but then you didn't talk about the third. So are we gonna like talk about it?
So the third theme is in it's in the PDF that's under the video if you download it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I will end up talking about it. It might be useful to read it if you want to be diligent.
Okay, great.
Okay, sure.
Make sure for Copernicus, so the only epicycle was that of the moon, correct?
For him, yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too.